We're now in the fourth week of this war, and it began with Trump saying Iran had given the US a huge prize. I've been tracking this war since day one, and you can see daily updates in my shorts. But here's week four, day 25 to 31. A cryptic message from Trump this week that the US had received a present tied to oil, gas, and the Strait of Hormuz, but no other details. And speaking of oil, Iran may actually be making more money during this war, and that's partly because the US temporarily eased some sanctions on Iranian oil. They did that to ease pressure on global oil prices. But after years of Iran pushing for sanctions relief in nuclear negotiations, the US just relaxed them in the middle of a war. Separately, the White House says talks are going well. Iran denies that. The White House also says the war could end in weeks, but is still sending thousands of troops to the region. And the week ended with the No Kings anti-government protests across the country. Here's what you missed day by day.
It's day 25 of the war, and Trump says Iran has given the US a gift.
They gave us a present, and the present arrived today. It was a very big present worth a tremendous amount of money. And I'm not going to tell you what that present is, but it was a very significant prize. And they gave it to us, and they said they were going to give it. So that meant one thing to me: we're dealing with the right people.
Now, he didn't say what it was, but suggested it was energy related involving the Strait of Hormuz. He also says negotiations are underway, led by JD Vance and Marco Rubio. Tehran officially says there are no direct talks, but Trump is insisting that they are talking to the right people, although he won't say who, since many of Iran's senior leadership have been killed. And this also comes as Iran is trying to stabilize its leadership following the killing of Ali Larijani last week. Larijani was seen as the establishment's tough but pragmatic power broker, and now he's been replaced by a former IRGC commander. So once again, the old guard is being replaced by a more hardline figure. And meanwhile, the Pentagon is reportedly moving more troops into the region despite Trump's talk of a deal. And that raises the question, if diplomacy is truly on the table, why dial up the military pressure? Or is it part of the bargaining strategy?
It's day 26, and there's been lots of talk about negotiations between the US and Iran, but what's actually happening? Trump says there are talks going on behind the scenes. Iran flatly denies it and says messages being passed back and forth is not the same thing as negotiations. To bring you up to date, this week, Israel's Channel 12 reported a proposed US 15-point plan. Now, the full text has not been independently confirmed, but there are some details in the media which include allowing international inspectors full access to Iran's nuclear sites, limiting Iran's missile capabilities, and keeping the Strait of Hormuz open, which Iran says is open, just not to the US. Some of these points were also agreed to by Iran in the previous nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of in 2018. In terms of this new proposal, White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt said there are elements of truth to the reports, but she also warned that some of the details that are out there aren't fully accurate. Now, the proposal was reportedly passed to Tehran via Pakistan, a country that maintains ties with both sides. And Iran responded today, calling the proposal excessive. And state-run Press TV says Iran has its own conditions for ending the war, including a complete halt to US-Israeli strikes in Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq, guarantees that the war will not restart, compensation for war damages, and recognition of Iran's authority over the Strait of Hormuz. But one of the issues is that it's still not clear who's fully in charge in Iran at the moment. The supreme leader has not been seen publicly or heard publicly since the war began, and several of Iran's senior figures have been killed. So, what does it all mean? It means we are still a long way off. The US is continuing to move military troops into the region, And there's a low level of trust, as Iran's foreign minister has repeatedly said. The last two times the US and Iran were in the middle of talks, the US launched strikes on Iran. Iran is making more money from oil since the war began, 20% more, according to Bloomberg. It's day 27 of the war, and while the headlines are focused on the front lines, there's also a massive shift happening in terms of the economy. Here's why. First, prices. Higher oil prices mean all oil producers make more money, including Iran. And Iran is still getting much of its oil to market because it controls the flow out of the Strait of Hormuz. Second, US policy. Last week, the US temporarily waived sanctions on about 140 million barrels of Iranian oil that's already been at sea. Much of that oil has already been bought by China, but what the US waiver does is it allows China to resell or redirect some of those shipments. Third, earning more per barrel. Now, before the war, Iran had to sell its oil at a steep discount because of sanctions. Now it can sell near market rates because the sanctions have been lifted. So why did the White House lift those sanctions? Well, it's trying to add more oil supply to the market to try to bring oil prices down. And US officials say they can still control Iran's revenue because banking sanctions remain in place. But in reality, Iran has spent years perfecting shadow sales, using barter deals, non-dollar payments, and middlemen. So, did it work? Not really, because Brent crude is still above $100 a barrel. And that's because the market doesn't just care about supply today, it cares about risk tomorrow with the ongoing war. So, Iran is making more money during the war, and it had sanctions eased, even if temporarily. So, day 28, and the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio talked a little bit about the timeline of the war. He spoke to reporters after meeting with his G7 counterparts in France, and this is what he said.
The objectives of this mission have been clear from the very first night the president announced it. We're going to destroy Iran's Navy. We've destroyed their Air Force. We're going to basically destroy their ability to make missiles and drones in their factories. We are on or ahead of schedule in that operation and expect to conclude it at the appropriate time here in a matter of weeks, not months. And the progress is going very well. Obviously, we have some work to do. We have to finish the job, and we are finishing that job.
He also said that Washington can meet all its objectives without using ground troops, but he acknowledged that the US was deploying some troops to the region, but he said it was to give the president maximum options. Now, Steve Witkoff, the White House special envoy, also said the US was hopeful of meetings with Iran within a week. Iran, on its part, insists there will be no negotiations while the strikes are ongoing. Iran also says the White House is trying to buy time and it's playing the markets. So the question is the White House really trying to wind this war down, or are they playing to public opinion? There was a new Reuters poll this week that shows that Trump is at his lowest approval point since coming to the White House this time around, based on higher fuel prices and people disapproving of the war. But he still has support amongst Republicans, although the number of Republicans disapproving of the war is climbing a little bit. So Trump will want to find a way to wind down this war. The question is how they do it and when they do it, because Iran's regime is still standing and those Iranian attacks on the ground are still ongoing. Across the US, protesters hit the streets with messages for the Trump administration.
Trump has to be stopped. And that's what No Kings is all about. Because he can't do all the things that he's been doing without the collusion of Congress and the goons in his administration. They're bound to him by fear of losing their own jobs, their own power. It's diabolical.
The marchers are part of what's called the No Kings movement, a nationwide network of organizations fighting against Donald Trump's policies.
And getting out here and saying, hey, we don't stand for this. This is really important.
The flagship march was held in Minneapolis, the site of 2 fatal shootings by federal agents during the operations in January this year. From Philadelphia to Chicago, New York to Washington, D.C., demonstrators demanded change. Here in Washington, various demonstrations across the city culminated in possibly one of the largest ones in the shadow of the Capitol behind me. The economy, the cost of living, and the war in Iran were top of mind for protesters.
We can't trust the leader of our country, that we are looking very poorly in the eyes of the world. Now we've got a war that was started on his whim, and many people are suffering, not just the ones that they're pushing out front to fight for us, but all over the world with, oil prices and gas prices going up.
The White House has dismissed the demonstrations outright.
The rumors out there are all paid protesters and it's just old people and all that. Well, look around. It's not paid protesters and it's not just old people out here.
Demonstrators believe the No Kings movement is still rising and growing stronger. Christy and her friends drove to D.C. from Chicago to help make sure that becomes a reality. Leonie Lacani, TRT World, Washington. If we were looking for any clarity on where we stand now with the war, I don't think Donald Trump offered that. He has made a number of comments in the last couple of hours between an interview with the Financial Times and speaking to reporters on Air Force One. And some of those comments he contradicted himself. So I'm just going to run through quickly some of the things that he said. So in terms of the regime change, we heard him speaking there that the U.S. is now dealing with a totally different group of people, which he described as, quote, very professional. In terms of oil, he mentioned that, his favorite thing is to take the oil, referencing what the U.S. has done in Venezuela, where the U.S. controls the oil industry there at the moment. And then he said that, that's something that he would like to do, but people have said he can't. Those are stupid people. He has said that the U.S. can just go ahead and take Kharg Island if he wants. Of course, we know that the Iranians are very ready and waiting for U.S. ground troops if that's something that the U.S. plans to do. And then he talked about how the people that they're dealing with at the moment, the talks are going well through Pakistani emissaries. He says that last week he mentioned that Iran had given the U.S. a prize. He didn't specify what it was, but we knew it was oil related to the Strait of Hormuz. And in this interview with the FT, he discusses that a bit further, or he points to it, saying that Iran had let about 20 oil tankers, Pakistani flagged oil tankers through, and that this was authorized by Iran's parliamentary speaker, so essentially pointing to the fact that those were the prizes or the presents that he was referring to last week. Now, at the same time, he talks about how the U.S. has hit 13,000 targets, has 3,000 left. We heard more of him saying things like the U.S. has destroyed and decimated Iran's capabilities. But of course, on the ground, we're seeing that Iran's missile and drone attacks are very much happening. So as I said, if we're looking for clarity, we got lots of comments from Trump that were all over the place. So, anything is possible going forward this week.